Chapter 1. A Life Worth Living. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Carter residence, casting the polished oak floors in a golden glow. Daniel Carter stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, carefully flipping a perfectly golden omelet in the pan. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, mingling with the faint citrus scent of the lemon soap Sophia had insisted on for the counters. 2 minutes, he called out over his shoulder, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He knew she'd still be upstairs, probably trying to make her eyeliner behave. If you're late for breakfast, I'm eating yours. Threaten me all you want, Carter, Sophia's voice floated down from the bedroom. I'm not letting you outshine me at your own big meeting. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. The sound of her voice always had a way of softening him, like sunlight cutting through an early morning fog. This was their routine. Every morning, his wife of 5 years teased him about his punctuality, and every morning he pretended to be annoyed. It was a rhythm they'd perfected. The omelet slid onto a plate with practiced ease, its edges crisped just enough to give the illusion of effortlessness. He sprinkled a pinch of parsley over the top and carried it to the table, where Sophia's plate, untouched, sat beside a steaming coffee mug. Sophia joined him a moment later, her dark hair falling in loose waves over the tailored blazer she had thrown on. A perfect mix of elegance and efficiency. She leaned down to kiss him on the cheek, her perfume sharp and floral, before settling into her chair. "Big day," she said, picking up her fork. Her green eyes sparkled with the kind of confidence that Daniel had always envied. "How are you feeling?" Daniel shrugged, a smile playing at his lips as he sipped his coffee. "Confident. It's not every day you pitch a multi-million-dollar design to the biggest name in real estate development." "Confident and humble," she teased, spearing a piece of omelet with her fork. "That's why I married you." Sophia's teasing was like oxygen to him, a constant reminder of how lucky he was. He had it all, a career that most architects could only dream of, a marriage that felt like it belonged in a movie, and a future that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of him. It wasn't just a good life. It was the life he had built brick by brick, with a combination of determination and sheer will. The boardroom was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the projector as Daniel clicked through the final slide of his presentation. The room was filled with polished mahogany and the sharp scent of fresh coffee, but Daniel was focused on the faces around the table, stern, calculating, and most importantly, captivated. "This isn't just a building," Daniel said, his voice steady and commanding. "It's a space that breathes, a place where people don't just work, they thrive." He clicked to the final render, a stunning image of glass and steel, curved like a wave, with lush greenery spilling down its terraces. The design was innovative, sustainable, and most importantly, breathtaking. As Daniel looked around the room, he saw it in their eyes. He had them. When the meeting ended, the handshake with the firm's CEO was firm and deliberate. "We'll be in touch soon, Daniel," the man said, his tone carrying just enough warmth to signal good news. "This is impressive work." Daniel nodded, keeping his cool, though his pulse thrummed in his ears. "Thank you, sir. I look forward to hearing from you." That evening, Daniel walked into his home with a bottle of champagne tucked under one arm and a bouquet of white lilies in the other. Sophia was already waiting for him in the kitchen, her arms crossed in an exaggerated show of impatience. "Well?" she said, raising an eyebrow. He raised the champagne in response. Her face lit up like the skyline at dusk. "I knew it." She crossed the room in 2 quick strides, throwing her arms around him. "I'm so proud of you." Daniel laughed, holding her close. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Damn right," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Now pop that bottle before I start crying." Later that night, as they stood together on the balcony of their apartment, the city stretched out before them in a sea of lights. The champagne bottle sat half empty on the table beside them, and Sophia leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "I think this is it. The life we've been working for. It feels like we've finally made it." Daniel smiled, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Yeah, it does. But the thing about perfection is that it never lasts." The bathroom tiles were cold beneath Daniel's bare feet as he brushed his teeth. the faint sound of jazz playing from the speaker on the counter. He had just turned off the tap when he noticed a small puddle of water near the shower. Frowning, he grabbed a towel to mop it up. But as he stepped forward, his foot slipped. It happened so quickly that he barely registered the motion. The sickening lurch of his body as his foot lost traction, the sharp crack as his head struck the edge of the sink, and the sudden, jarring silence that followed. When Daniel opened his eyes, he wasn't in the bathroom anymore. The first thing he noticed was the warmth of the sunlight against his skin. It filtered through the curtains of a cozy, unfamiliar bedroom, casting soft patterns on the walls. The sheets beneath him were crisp and clean, and the faint smell of lavender lingered in the air. For a moment, he lay there, confused, his mind struggling to piece together where he was and how he had gotten there. The bathroom, the accident, it all felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. And then he heard it, the faint sound of children laughing outside the window. Daniel sat up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was unfamiliar, but it felt right, like it was exactly where he was supposed to be. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was beautiful, with soft features and a warm smile that lit up the room. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle and familiar. "I was starting to think you'd sleep all day." Daniel stared at her, his mind reeling. He didn't know her name, but somehow he knew her. As she crossed the room and leaned down to kiss him on the forehead, Daniel felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. "Come on," she said, taking his hand and pulling him to his feet. "The kids are waiting for you." The kids. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't have kids, did he? But as he followed the woman out of the bedroom and into the warm, sunlit hallway, the questions faded from his mind like mist in the morning light. Whoever she was, wherever he was, this was home now. Chapter 2. The Illusion. The sunlight was blinding as Daniel stepped outside, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. The warmth of the morning wrapped around him like a comforting embrace, and the sound of laughter drifted on the breeze, high-pitched giggles and the faint thud of a ball bouncing against pavement. He squinted, shielding his eyes as he surveyed the small yard in front of the house. Two children, a boy and a girl, were playing catch on the lawn. The boy, no older than 8, had dark hair that stuck up in messy tufts, and the girl, a little younger, wore a yellow sundress and had a gap-toothed grin that felt oddly familiar. "Daddy!" the girl called out, waving excitedly. Her voice struck something deep in his chest, a note of recognition he couldn't quite place. Daniel hesitated, the word catching him off guard. Daddy. The title felt foreign and yet right, as if it had always belonged to him but had been misplaced for a time. He raised a hand in a tentative wave, and the girl giggled before returning to her game. "Are you just going to stand there?" the woman behind him teased, her voice laced with amusement. "They've been waiting for you all morning. Clara was about to come drag you out herself." Clara. The name hit him like a whisper of a memory, familiar and comforting. And yet, it didn't quite fit into the framework of his thoughts, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. "I was just taking it all in," Daniel said, his voice coming out softer than he intended. He turned to look at her, this stranger with a face that felt like home. Her smile was radiant, her brown eyes warm and reassuring. "It's a beautiful morning." "It always is here," she said, slipping her hand into his and squeezing gently. "Now go, they're dying to show you their new game." Daniel allowed himself to be nudged forward, his feet crunching on the gravel path as he approached the children. The boy tossed the ball to him, his movements clumsy but determined. "Catch, Dad," the boy said, his grin wide and infectious. Dad. The word hung in the air, heavy with significance. Daniel caught the ball instinctively, his hands closing around it with a sense of muscle memory that felt out of place. He tossed it back, and the boy laughed as he scrambled to catch it. "What's the game?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the strange flutter in his chest. "It's called Don't Drop It," the boy said proudly, as if he'd invented the most ingenious game in the world. "You just throw the ball and don't drop it." Daniel chuckled, the sound surprising him with its ease. "Sounds like a classic." Inside the house, the smell of breakfast still lingered in the air. Eggs, toast, and coffee mingling into a pleasant aroma that made Daniel's stomach rumble. The house itself was modest but cozy, with soft yellow walls and wooden furniture that gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't like the sleek, modern apartment he remembered. Wait, what did he remember? The thought struck him like a wave, leaving him momentarily unsteady. He paused in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame as fragments of memories fluttered at the edges of his mind. A city skyline. Blueprints spread across a polished mahogany table. A woman. No, Sophia laughing over a glass of champagne. The memories felt real, tangible, but they slipped through his fingers like sand. Daniel? The woman. Emma, he realized suddenly, her name surfacing in his mind as if it had always been there, appeared at his side, her brow furrowed in concern. Are you okay? He blinked, the memories dissolving like mist. Yeah, he said, forcing a smile. Just tired, I guess. Emma studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face before she nodded. You've been working too hard, she said, brushing a hand lightly over his arm. Why don't you take it easy today? Go for a walk, clear your head. Daniel nodded, though the unease in his chest lingered. That sounds good. The town was small, the kind of place that felt plucked out of a picture book. Cobblestone streets wound past rows of charming houses with colorful shutters and flower boxes overflowing with petunias and marigolds. A bakery on the corner filled the air with the scent of fresh bread, and a cafe across the street buzzed with cheerful chatter. Everyone Daniel passed greeted him with a warm smile or a friendly wave, as if they'd known him for years. It should have been comforting, but instead, it unsettled him. The perfection of it all, the colors, the sounds, the faces, felt too deliberate, like a stage set meticulously designed to look real. The people greeted him by name, their voices warm and familiar, but he couldn't place their faces. He felt like an actor in a play he hadn't rehearsed for, fumbling through his lines without knowing the script. As he walked, a faint sound caught his attention. A rhythmic dripping, steady and insistent. He stopped, his eyes scanning the empty street, but there was no source. The sound seemed to echo in his head, growing louder, more urgent. Drip, drip, drip. Daniel? He turned sharply, his heart racing, to find a man standing a few steps away. His face was vaguely familiar, though Daniel couldn't quite place him. The man was smiling, but there was something off about it, something too wide, too practiced. Morning, neighbor, the man said, tipping his hat. Beautiful day, isn't it? Daniel nodded slowly, his pulse still thrumming in his ears. Yeah, beautiful. The man's smile didn't falter as he turned and walked away, his steps too even, too precise. Daniel watched him go, the dripping sound still echoing faintly in his mind. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Emma slept soundly beside him, her breathing soft and steady. But Daniel's mind refused to quiet. The day's events played over and over in his head. The children's laughter, the bakery's warm scent, the man's too perfect smile, and beneath it all, the dripping. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, but the sound only grew louder. Drip, drip, drip. It was relentless, burrowing into his mind like a splinter. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with fragments of another life. A sleek, modern apartment, a glass of champagne, a sharp crack against porcelain. And then, just before he woke, he saw her. Sophia, her face blurry but unmistakable, her voice desperate as she called his name. Daniel! Chapter 3. Cracks in the Perfect World. The morning began like all the others. The sunlight filtered through the curtains in lazy golden streams, warming the room with an inviting glow. Emma's soft humming drifted from the kitchen, accompanied by the faint clatter of plates and the aromatic pull of freshly brewed coffee. The house was alive with warmth, comfort, and familiarity. But for Daniel, it felt wrong. He lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as a faint pressure built in his chest. Something was gnawing at him, a vague, unshakable unease that he couldn't name. The dream he'd had the night before lingered at the edges of his mind, fragmented and hazy. Sophia's voice calling his name. The sharp crack of something breaking, a sense of falling. "Daniel?" Emma's voice broke through his reverie, cheerful and light. "Breakfast is ready?" He sat up slowly, rubbing his temples. "Coming," he said, though his voice sounded distant even to himself. At the breakfast table, Clara and Ethan were locked in a playful argument about whose turn it was to walk the dog. Emma served pancakes with syrup and fresh strawberries, her smile as radiant as ever. Everything about the scene screamed perfection, too much perfection. "So what's the plan for today?" Emma asked as she sat down beside him, her hand brushing his lightly. "You've been working so hard lately. Maybe we could take the kids to the park, have a picnic?" Daniel hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "Actually, I was thinking of walking into town, maybe checking out the library." Emma tilted her head, her smile faltering just slightly. "The library? You hate libraries." He frowned, taken aback. "I don't hate libraries." "Yes, you do," she said, laughing lightly. "You've always said they're too quiet, remember? You said it feels like everyone's watching you whenever you go in." Daniel stared at her, his pulse quickening. He didn't remember ever saying that. In fact, he was certain he'd never said anything of the sort. Libraries had always been a comfort to him, sanctuaries of thought and inspiration. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. "Right," he said instead, forcing a smile. "Maybe I'll just take a walk then." The town was bustling as Daniel wandered its cobblestone streets, but there was something about the rhythm of it all that set his teeth on edge. The bakery emitted its usual tempting aroma of fresh bread and pastries. The cafe buzzed with chatter, and the flower shop displayed its vibrant bouquets. Yet, beneath the facade of normalcy, everything felt off. The people were too friendly, their movements too smooth, too practiced. Each "Good morning, Daniel" was delivered with the same inflection, the same smile. A woman sitting on a bench laughed at something her companion said, but the sound was hollow, almost mechanical. It was like watching a performance, the actors repeating their lines with perfect precision. As Daniel walked, he noticed something strange. The same man he'd passed the day before, the one with the too wide smile, was standing on the corner again, tipping his hat to passers-by. This time, Daniel stopped and stared. The man didn't seem to notice. He simply stood there, tipping his hat and smiling over and over, like a wind-up toy stuck in a loop. "Excuse me," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Do I know you?" The man turned to him, his smile widening unnaturally. "Good morning, neighbor. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Daniel's stomach churned. "Yeah, beautiful," he said, his voice hollow. He backed away slowly. The man's smile burned into his mind. By the time Daniel reached the library, his nerves were frayed. The building stood at the edge of the town square, its brick facade weathered but welcoming. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors, half expecting the same eerie perfection he'd encountered outside. But the library was different. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The air was thick with the musty scent of old books, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the shelves. There were no smiling faces here, no cheerful greetings. For the first time in days, Daniel felt alone. He wandered aimlessly through the aisles, running his fingers along the spines of books. The silence was comforting at first, but as he moved deeper into the library, it began to feel oppressive. He turned a corner and found himself in a narrow aisle lined with books on philosophy and psychology. One title caught his eye: The Fragility of Perception. He pulled the book from the shelf and flipped it open to a random page. The words on the page stopped him cold. Reality is not an absolute, but a construct of the mind. It is shaped by memory, perception, and belief, elements as fragile and malleable as glass. Daniel stared at the words, his hands trembling. The phrase echoed in his mind, triggering a cascade of memories. The sound of a champagne cork popping, the skyline outside his apartment window, Sophia's laughter. His grip on the book tightened as his breathing quickened. "Can I help you?" Daniel spun around, nearly dropping the book. A librarian stood behind him, her expression neutral but watchful. She was older, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through him. I, uh... He swallowed hard, closing the book. I was just looking. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. Let me know if you need anything. Daniel watched her disappear around the corner, the sound of her footsteps fading into the silence. He placed the book back on the shelf and left the library, the words still ringing in his ears. That night, the dreams returned. He was in a sleek, modern apartment, standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked a sprawling city skyline. The lights of the city twinkled like stars, and behind him, he could hear Sophia's laughter. Daniel, she said, her voice warm and familiar. He turned to see her standing in the kitchen, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was radiant, her smile lighting up the room. But then something changed. The light in the apartment flickered, and Sophia's smile faltered. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Daniel, she said again, her voice now tinged with fear. Wake up. He stepped toward her, but the floor beneath him gave way. He was falling, the apartment dissolving around him, Sophia's voice fading into the void. Wake up. Daniel jolted awake, his heart racing. Emma stirred beside him, her brow furrowing as she mumbled something incoherent. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. The dream had felt so real, more real than the world he was living in. And Sophia's voice. It was as if she was trying to reach him, trying to pull him back to something he couldn't quite grasp. He looked over at Emma, her features serene in the dim light. She was perfect, just like everything else in this town. Too perfect. Daniel's chest tightened as a single horrifying thought took root in his mind. What if none of this was real? Chapter 4. The Revelation. The morning light streamed through the bedroom window as it always did, warm and golden, bathing the room in its familiar glow. But to Daniel, it felt oppressive. Each ray of light seemed to highlight the cracks in his carefully constructed reality, illuminating the lies he could no longer ignore. He sat at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, as Emma's cheerful voice called to him from the kitchen. Breakfast is ready, she said, the same words, the same tone, the same perfect delivery as every other morning. Daniel stared at the floor, his chest tightening. He didn't respond. Downstairs, the scene was as picturesque as ever. Clara and Ethan were seated at the table, their laughter filling the room as Emma flipped pancakes on the stove. The smell of syrup and butter hung in the air, rich and comforting. Morning, sleepyhead, Emma said, turning to him with a smile as he entered the room. You're just in time. Pancakes are fresh off the griddle. Daniel didn't answer. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. The way the sunlight hit the table, the perfect stack of pancakes on Clara's plate, the rhythmic tapping of Ethan's fork against the edge of his glass. It all felt rehearsed. Daddy? Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. She looked up at him, her bright eyes filled with concern. Are you okay? Daniel forced a smile, though it felt like his face was cracking under the strain. I'm fine, sweetheart, he said, his voice hollow. Just tired. Emma's brow furrowed, and she set down the spatula. Daniel, you've been acting strange lately. Is something bothering you? He opened his mouth to respond, to deflect, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Emma and the children behind. The air outside felt heavy, thick with humidity, as Daniel wandered through the town. The streets were as busy as ever, filled with smiling faces and warm greetings. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that every eye was on him, every smile hiding something sinister. Good morning, Daniel, a woman called from across the street, waving cheerfully. Daniel didn't respond. He kept walking, his mind racing. The dream from the night before was still vivid in his memory. Sophia's voice, the shattering glass, her desperate plea for him to wake up. It felt so real, more real than the world he was living in now. As he turned a corner, he saw the man with the too wide smile standing on the same corner as before, tipping his hat to passers-by. Daniel stopped, his hands curling into fists. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger and fear. The man turned to him, his smile widening unnaturally. "Good morning, neighbor. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Daniel's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "I said, who are you?" The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, his smile frozen, his eyes unblinking. Daniel's chest tightened as he backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The world around him felt surreal, like a poorly constructed set. The buildings seemed too pristine, the colors too vivid, the people too perfect. He needed answers. Daniel found himself back at the library, the quiet sanctuary that had offered him a brief reprieve from the town's oppressive perfection. The air inside was cool and still, the faint smell of old paper lingering in the dim light. He made his way to the psychology section, his fingers trailing along the spines of books as he scanned the titles. His heart pounded as he pulled the fragility of perception from the shelf once more. He flipped it open to the page he had read before, the words leaping out at him like a warning. Reality is not an absolute, but a construct of the mind. It is shaped by memory, perception, and belief, elements as fragile and malleable as glass. Daniel's breath hitched as he stared at the words, their meanings sinking in. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, dreams, and moments of unease. The perfect town, the perfect family, the glitches and inconsistencies. None of it was real. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, the house quiet and dark around him, as the pieces of his life fell apart in his mind. The weight of the realization was suffocating. Emma joined him after a while, her movements soft and deliberate as she sat beside him on the couch. "Daniel," she said gently, her voice tinged with concern. "What's going on? You've been so distant lately." He turned to her, his eyes searching her face. She was beautiful, radiant, everything he had ever wanted. But was she real? "Emma," he said, his voice trembling, "I need you to tell me the truth." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "This world," he said, gesturing around them. "This town. Our life. It doesn't feel real. There are things I remember, things that don't fit. Please, tell me what's going on." Emma's expression softened, and for a moment, Daniel thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Pity, sadness, guilt. "Daniel," she said softly, taking his hand in hers, "you've been through so much. You don't need to do this to yourself." "Just tell me the truth," he shouted, pulling his hand away. His voice echoed through the room, the raw desperation in it startling even to himself. Emma stared at him, her composure cracking. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't real." Daniel's heart stopped. "What?" Emma looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're not here, Daniel. This life, this town, me, it's all in your mind. You're in a coma. You've been in a coma since the accident." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not possible. I feel it. This is real." Emma reached out to him, her touch warm and comforting. "I know it feels real," she said, "but it's not. None of it is. You're lying in a hospital bed, and your mind created this world to protect you." Daniel's hands trembled as he buried his face in them, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "No," he whispered. "It can't be true. I have a life here, a family. I'm so sorry, Daniel," Emma said, her voice breaking. "But it's time to wake up." He looked up, and for a moment he saw the world around him begin to shift. The walls of the house flickered, the edges dissolving like smoke. The room around him began to collapse, the colors bleeding together into a swirling void. Daniel clung to Emma, his heart pounding. "Don't leave me," he begged. "Please don't leave me." Emma smiled sadly, her form beginning to blur. "I'll always be with you," she said, "but you have to go now." and then she was gone. Daniel's world crumbled around him, the town, the house, the people all dissolving into nothingness. He was falling, tumbling through the void, Sophia's voice echoing faintly in the distance. "Wake up, Daniel." Chapter 5. Awakening. The first thing Daniel noticed was the sound. It was faint at first, a distant rhythmic beeping that seemed to echo somewhere far away. Then came the murmur of voices, low and muffled, as though they were underwater. Slowly the sounds grew sharper, cutting through the thick fog that clung to his mind. The second thing he noticed was the pain. It wasn't sharp, but dull and persistent, radiating from the back of his skull and spreading through his entire body. His limbs felt heavy, as though they were weighed down by invisible anchors, and his throat was dry, raw, as if he hadn't swallowed in days. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, and the light stabbed into his retinas like a blade. He groaned, squeezing them shut again as the beeping grew louder, more insistent. "He's waking up." The voice was clear now, calm, clinical, and unfamiliar. Daniel forced his eyes open again, squinting against the harsh fluorescent light overhead. The room slowly came into focus. White walls, sterile equipment, and the steady hum of monitors. A hospital. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the sharp pang that shot through his neck. A man in a white coat stood at the foot of the bed, his expression neutral but alert. Beside him was a nurse, her hands hovering near the IV line that ran into Daniel's arm. "Mr. Carter," the doctor said, his voice steady but measured. "Can you hear me?" Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came out. He tried again, his throat straining against the dryness. "Yes," he croaked, his voice barely audible. The doctor nodded. "Good. Take it slow. You've been through a lot." Daniel's mind was a whirlpool of confusion and disorientation. He struggled to piece together what had happened, but his thoughts were fragmented, slippery. The last thing he remembered was Emma, Clara, Ethan, the warm sunlight streaming through the windows of their home. But now they were gone, wiped away as if they had never existed. "How long?" Daniel rasped, his voice cracking. "How long have I been here?" The doctor hesitated, glancing at the nurse before answering. "You've been in a coma for 6 days. You suffered a severe head injury after falling in your bathroom. We weren't sure if you were going to wake up." 6 days. Daniel's heart sank. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. He had lived years in that world. He had built a life, a family. He had loved. The weight of it pressed down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. "No," he whispered, shaking his head weakly. "No, that's not right." The nurse stepped forward, her voice gentle. "You've been through a traumatic experience, Mr. Carter. It's normal to feel disoriented, especially after such a long period of unconsciousness." Disoriented. The word felt like a cruel understatement. Daniel's chest tightened as memories of his fabricated life flooded his mind. Emma's smile, Clara's laugh, the way Ethan had called him Dad. They felt so real, more real than the sterile room he now found himself in. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he turned his head away from the doctor and nurse, staring at the blank wall beside him. "It wasn't a dream," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It couldn't have been." Hours passed, though Daniel barely noticed. The doctor came and went, running tests, checking vitals, speaking in a calm, detached tone that grated against Daniel's fraying nerves. Friends and family visited, faces he recognized but couldn't bring himself to connect with. Their words of relief and joy washed over him like static, meaningless and distant. The world outside the hospital window was gray and muted, the city skyline a far cry from the vibrant, idyllic town he had left behind. The sounds of car horns and distant chatter felt foreign, jarring, as though they belonged to someone else's reality. Sophia arrived in the late afternoon. She burst into the room, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Daniel," she breathed, rushing to his bedside. "Oh my God, you're awake." He looked at her, his heart twisting. She was beautiful, just as he remembered. Dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, green eyes wide with emotion. But seeing her now felt like staring at a photograph of someone long gone, a relic of a past life. She threw her arms around him, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes attached to his body. "I was so scared," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I lost you." Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her embrace, the warmth of her touch, everything about her felt foreign. She was his wife, he knew that, but she wasn't Emma. And that realization was like a knife twisting in his chest. When she finally pulled back, she searched his face, her brow furrowing. "Daniel, what's wrong?" He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain it to her? How could he tell her that in the span of 6 days, he had lived an entire lifetime with another woman, another family, that he had loved them, mourned them, and now felt their absence like a phantom limb? Instead, he shook his head, his gaze dropping to his lap. "I'm just tired," he said quietly. Sophia reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft. "You don't have to talk about it now. I'm just glad you're here." Daniel forced a weak smile, though it felt like his face might crack under the weight of it. "Me too," he lied. That night, Daniel lay awake in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the monitors beside him. The rhythmic beeping was steady, relentless, like a metronome ticking away the seconds of a life he no longer recognized. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he was back in the town. He could feel the warmth of the sunlight on his skin, hear the laughter of his children, smell the scent of lavender on Emma's hair. It was so vivid, so real, that for a fleeting second, he believed he was there. But when he opened his eyes, the illusion was gone. All that remained was the cold, sterile reality of the hospital room. Daniel's chest tightened as tears streamed down his face. He had woken up, but a part of him wished he hadn't. Chapter 6: The Psychological Fallout. The walls of the apartment had never felt so small. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the muted television screen. The news anchor's lips moved, but the words were a distant hum, drowned out by the relentless churn of his thoughts. The world outside the window was gray and lifeless, the city skyline shrouded in a haze that seemed to mirror the fog in his mind. Sophia moved around the apartment with quiet efficiency, unpacking the groceries she had brought home. She glanced at Daniel from time to time, her concern etched into the lines of her face. It had been a week since he had been discharged from the hospital, and though his body was healing, he was far from the man she remembered. "Daniel," she said gently, setting a bag of apples on the counter, "have you thought about what Dr. Levington suggested? The therapist he recommended?" Daniel didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the television, though he wasn't watching it. His mind was elsewhere, back in the town, back with Emma, Clara, and Ethan. Their faces haunted him, vivid and sharp, as if they were just outside his reach. "Daniel," Sophia said again, her voice firmer this time. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You can't keep shutting me out. I know this has been hard for you, but you need to talk to someone." "I'm fine," he said, his voice low and flat. "You're not fine," she said, her brow furrowing. "You barely eat, you barely sleep. You don't talk to me or anyone else. You're not okay, and that's okay, but you can't do this alone." Daniel pulled his hands away from hers, leaning back against the couch. "You don't understand," he muttered. "Then help me understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, Daniel, I'm trying." He closed his eyes, his chest tightening. How could he explain it to her? How could he make her understand that the life he had lived in his coma felt more real than the one he had woken up to? That he still heard the laughter of his children, still felt the warmth of Emma's hand in his, still smelled the lavender on her skin? That he mourned them as though they had truly existed? "I can't," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia's shoulders sagged, and she stood slowly, her movements heavy with defeat. "I don't know how to help you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know if you want me to." She turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving Daniel alone with the weight of his thoughts. The therapist's office was quiet, the air thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and leather. Daniel sat in the chair across from Dr. Levington, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The older man sat with a notepad balanced on his knee, his pen poised but unmoving. "So, Daniel," Dr. Levington said, his voice calm and even. "Sophia tells me you're having a hard time readjusting since the accident. Do you want to tell me about that?" Daniel shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Not much to tell," he said flatly. "Well," the therapist said, leaning back in his chair, "why don't we start with how you've been feeling?" Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "How I've been feeling," he repeated. "I feel like I've been ripped out of one life and shoved into another. Like I don't belong here, like I woke up in someone else's skin." Dr. Levington nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's not uncommon for coma survivors," he said. "Many experience vivid dreams during their unconscious state, and those dreams can feel very real. It can be difficult to separate those experiences from reality once they wake up." "They weren't dreams," Daniel said sharply, his eyes snapping up to meet the therapist's. "It wasn't just some random collection of images or feelings. It was a life. I lived it. I had a wife, kids, a home. I was happy." "And now you're grieving that life," Dr. Levington said gently. "Even if it wasn't real, it felt real to you. And that loss is very real." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "It's not just grief," he said, his voice low. "It's guilt. Guilt for missing them, for missing a life that wasn't real, instead of being grateful for the one I have now." "Guilt is a natural response," the therapist said. "But it's important to remember that your feelings don't make you a bad person. They're just feelings. They don't have to define you." Daniel looked away, his chest tightening. "I don't even know who I am anymore," he admitted. "The man I was before the accident, he's gone, and the man I was in that other life, he never existed. So who does that leave me with?" Dr. Levington was silent for a moment, his pen tapping lightly against the notepad. "That's something we'll work on together," he said finally. "Rebuilding your sense of self. Finding a way to honor what you've been through while moving forward." Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure he believed that was possible. The days blurred together after that. Daniel went through the motions of living, but everything felt hollow. He ate because he had to, slept because his body demanded it, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. The vibrant, successful life he had once known seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the vivid, painful echoes of the life he had lost. He began to avoid Sophia, unable to bear the weight of her concern or the quiet disappointment in her eyes. He spent hours wandering the city, his feet carrying him aimlessly through crowded streets and empty parks. Everywhere he went, he saw them. Emma's smile in the face of a stranger, Clara's laugh in the giggles of a child, Ethan's voice in the chatter of a group of boys. One afternoon, as he walked through a park, he saw a family sitting on a blanket beneath a tree. A woman with long brown hair was reading a book, her head resting on the shoulder of a man who looked at her with quiet adoration. Two children chased each other around the blanket, their laughter ringing through the air. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his chest tightening. For a moment, he was back in the town, sitting under the sun with Emma, Clara, and Ethan. The memory was so vivid that he could almost feel the warmth of the sunlight on his skin, hear the rustle of the leaves in the breeze. But when he blinked, the illusion shattered. The family wasn't his. They never had been. He turned and walked away, his throat tight and his vision blurred by tears. That night, Daniel sat alone in the darkened apartment, a glass of whiskey clutched in his hand. The faint glow of the city lights seeped through the window, casting long shadows across the room. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could hear Emma's voice, soft and reassuring. "You have to move forward," she said, her words echoing in his mind. "You have to find a way to live." Daniel opened his eyes, his jaw tightening. He didn't know if he could. But as he sat there, the glass trembling in his hand, he realized that he had to try. Chapter 7. The Final Choice. The bathroom floor was cold beneath Daniel's feet, the tiles smooth and damp from the steam of the shower. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. though he couldn't tell if it was coming from the soap on the counter or the memory that had etched itself into his senses. He stared at the mirror, his reflection pale and gaunt, the hollows beneath his eyes a testament to weeks of sleepless nights. He barely recognized himself. The man he had been before the accident, confident, ambitious, full of life, was gone, replaced by a shadow of someone who existed between two realities. The man he had been in the coma felt more real than the face staring back at him now. That man had been a husband, a father, a teacher. He had been happy. Daniel reached out and touched the surface of the mirror, his fingertips brushing the cool glass. The reflection stared back at him, but it didn't feel like his own. It felt like a stranger's. Behind him, the apartment was quiet. Sophia had left for work hours ago, her parting words heavy with unspoken worry. She had tried so hard to pull him back into the life they had built together, but no matter how much she tried, Daniel couldn't seem to find his way back. The life they had shared before the accident felt like a distant echo, a faint melody drowned out by the symphony of his other world, his real world. In the weeks since his release from the hospital, Daniel had tried to rebuild his life, to piece together the fragments of who he used to be. He had gone to therapy, taken long walks, and even tried to lose himself in his old hobbies, sketching, reading, cooking. But no matter what he did, he couldn't escape the pull of the life he had left behind. He dreamed of them every night. Emma, with her warm smile and steady presence. Clara, with her gap-toothed grin and infectious laughter. Ethan, with his messy hair and boundless energy. He could still hear their voices, feel their touch, see their faces as vividly as if they were standing right in front of him. But when he woke, they were gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding reality of the life he no longer wanted. The world he had woken up to felt wrong, like a poorly made imitation of the one he had lost. The colors were duller, the sounds muted, the emotions hollow. Even Sophia, beautiful, kind, and steadfast, felt like a ghost of someone he used to love. He couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here, that he had been torn from the life he was meant to live. And so, he had made a decision. Daniel walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his movements slow and deliberate. The apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. He set the glass down on the counter and turned toward the bathroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The scene was perfect. He had cleaned the bathroom meticulously, ensuring that every detail was just right. The sink gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light, and the tiles were spotless, save for the faint sheen of water near the shower. He stepped inside, his bare feet pressing against the cold, damp floor. His gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where the edge of the sink jutted out like a sentinel waiting to fulfill its duty. He ran his fingers along the edge, the smooth porcelain cool against his skin. This was where it had happened. This was where the accident had stolen him away from the life he had known and thrust him into the coma. This was where he had found Emma, Clara, and Ethan. This was where he had been happy. And this was where he would find them again. Daniel moved with purpose, his motions fluid and calm. He turned on the shower, letting the water cascade onto the tiles, the steam rising around him in soft, curling tendrils. The sound of the water was soothing, almost hypnotic, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. He could almost hear Emma's voice, calling to him from the other side. Her tone was soft, reassuring, the way it always was when she spoke to him after a long day. "You can come back to us," she whispered, her voice like a melody in his mind. "We're waiting for you." Daniel opened his eyes, his pulse steady. He stepped closer to the sink, his bare feet sliding slightly on the damp floor. The memory of the first fall played out in his mind, the sudden loss of balance, the sharp crack, the blinding pain, and then the warmth of the sunlight, the sound of children laughing, the life that had unfolded before him. He wanted it back. He needed it back. The glass of water he had poured sat on the edge of the sink, precariously balanced. He reached for it, his hand trembling slightly, and tilted it just enough to let the water spill onto the floor. The puddle spread slowly, the water pooling around his feet like a halo. Daniel stared down at it, his chest tightening. This was it. This was his chance to go back, to leave behind the hollow emptiness of this world and return to the one where he belonged. He took a deep breath, his heart thudding in his ears. Daniel. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Emma's voice, calling to him from somewhere beyond the veil of this reality. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm coming," he whispered, and then he stepped forward. The floor was slick beneath his feet. He felt his body lurch as he lost his balance, the world tilting around him in slow motion. For a brief, weightless moment, he was suspended in the air, and then the sharp, sickening crack of his head hitting the edge of the sink echoed through the bathroom, followed by the heavy thud of his body collapsing to the ground. The apartment was silent. The water from the shower continued to run, the steady patter of droplets mingling with the faint hum of the city outside. Daniel lay motionless on the cold, wet tiles, his eyes closed, his expression peaceful. And somewhere, in the space between this world and the next, the sound of children laughing echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing moment. The end. Thank you for listening to this epic novel by Short Verse Creations. Please like and subscribe.